Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at solicitation of Japan, still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific.
We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when.
Great Britain watched the rise of Nazi Germany and the eventual outbreak of the Second World War from their island nation. How could a champion of democracy stand by and watch a fascist regime grow unchecked and commit genocide? Nationalism can be argued as the main factor. Great Britain wanted to preserve its own prosperity before jumping into another costly war. Their role as a spectator came from their economic plight brought about by the Great Depression. The United States' Great Depression in 1929 had wreaked havoc on Great Britain's economy. During the slump in productivity, the empire's hold on imperial territories was put in jeopardy as they were losing the means by which to protect their expansive empire. Great Britain had gone from a world power looking to expand to a country barely holding on to what they had. As a Foreign Office memorandum stated in the 1930s, "We have no territorial ambitions nor desires for aggrandizement. We have all that we want, perhaps more."
So Great Britain avoided entering World War II for so long because they had the nationalistic ideal of securing the prosperity of their own country. This is evidenced by the policy of appeasement that was brought about by Chamberlain in the 1930s. While Hitler and Mussolini were working their way through the middle of Europe and gaining power under their fascist regimes, Chamberlain decided that Great Britain didn't have any place or the means to defend democracy in continental Europe. So instead, he decided to maintain a outside bystander point of view.
A weakened empire became an opportunity for countries looking to obtain a boost to their economy and status. The British territories were a target for other countries because they were a source of raw materials. Since the Great Depression had affected the globe, countries sought to fix their economic plight through aggressive military tactics to acquire new territory that would provide a source of wealth and resource. There were select countries that had been left out of the earlier colonial era that saw a weak British Empire as their opportunity to obtain their own colonies. For example, Japan had been looking to expand in the Pacific Ocean and into China in order to gain strategic and economic advantages. Winston Churchill was quoted in 1925 as saying, "I do not believe Japan has any idea of attacking the British Empire, or that there is any danger of her doing so for at least a generation to come." However, only 6 short years later, Japan invaded British Manchuria and established a monopoly on trade. Another one of these countries was Germany, who began their march to expand their territory in the 1930s. And this is where Great Britain and her policy of appeasement comes in. In order to avoid a conflict with aggressive Germany, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain chose to give in to the demands of Hitler. The first instance came when Hitler demanded the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. At first, Chamberlain disapproved the action, but after Hitler assembled a sizable fighting force with intentions of invading, he handed the land over. But Hitler's hunger would lead him to want more and more land, and Chamberlain continued to appease him. Winston Churchill likened the negotiations to a man demanding £1, then, when it is offered, demanding £2.
Not only was their economy suffering during this time, but they didn't have the means, military means, to assert themselves in the European theater. So, when it came to trying to defend democracy and exerting their force against Hitler and Mussolini and the Nazis, they had to take a back seat.
The appeasement policy was all in an effort to avoid another disastrous and costly war for the Brits. Inevitably, Hitler's aggression would go too far for Britain to gamble with democracy in Europe, and after Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939, Great Britain would declare war and lead Europe into another world war against Germany.
Japan's main involvement in World War II can be directly correlated with the attack on Pearl Harbor. We see a very strategic and militaristic attack with thousands of pilots. With this attack, they were able to take out most of the United States Pacific Fleet, taking about 120 ships along with thousands of men. And we see this development of the kamikaze pilot, which essentially translated to something closely to a suicide bomber. And it's really interesting to try to figure out how these Japanese were able to inspire all of these young men to volunteer their lives to join this war.
The Japanese word kamikaze, meaning divine wind, is often not associated with its symbolic meaning, but rather portrays a picture of death and war in remembrance of an attack on Pearl Harbor. During a time of great detention, the word basically took on the meaning of a suicide pilot, as they took their own lives by crashing their planes into the naval base. Japan orchestrated this mass suicidal act with these kamikaze pilots. So how exactly did Japan motivate thousands of young men to volunteer their lives for the country? The recipe for Japan involved a highly nationalistic view by the Japanese people and years of rising negative effects directly resulting from dependency of Western countries. This ultimately supplied the Japanese people with the means to fight for their country, even in ways that seem extreme. Led by influential emperors, anti-Asian sentiments, and fueled by a dependency on other countries, Japan entered World War II on nationalistic intentions to have their country be known as a power.
Japan has always been led with a monarchy, led by an emperor or a shogunate, and we see that because of this position, they're able to put their leader and this central government sort of on a pedestal, so we kind of see that there's an influence over the people. And during this time, the Emperor Hirohito, he was of samurai descent, so we see also a connection with warrior-like qualities and this trying to become militaristic. And on the other side of the world, we see that there's a West imperialism growing, and the way that Japan decided that they were going to stay above the rest of the people was to also become imperialistic and militaristic and take over South Asia. So not only do we have this warrior leadership with battle qualities, we also see that they want to become imperialistic and militaristic, and that can be connected. We could see that this might influence young men to join the war and fight for their cause and for their country.
Japan's main involvement, and by far the largest in World War II, can be attributed to the horrible and destructive event that occurred on December 7, 1941, at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The event included strategic military attacks on the United States Pacific Fleet, where 7,465 kamikaze pilots flew to their deaths and took with them 120 ships and thousands of lives. It was one of the most efficient and strategic attacks in history, which could only have been carried out by the massive amounts of available Japanese pilots. This catapulted both the United States and Japan into a Pacific War, which could only have been pulled off because of willing Japanese nationalists. Racism, historically influential leaders, and competitive imperialism all brought together a reason for the Japanese people to fight for their country in the inevitable World War. But what about the United States' decision to embargo imported oil in order to deplete Japan's supply, which is commonly connected with the reason to why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor? Pearl Harbor can be looked at as an economic response to the oil embargo by the United States, but it cannot be overlooked that the rise of nationalism fueled the fire for such a violent attack. The attack itself may not have taken place without nationalism.
I don't want to set the world on fire.
As the armistice ended the physical fighting, the Treaty of Versailles closed the book on World War I. Tension still remained and competition was at an all-time high in the first half of the 20th century. Repercussions from the First World War still existed even 15 to 20 years after the end of the war, and when the Nazi superpower led by Adolf Hitler decided to invade Poland in 1939, it sparked yet again another chain reaction that would lead to a Second World War.
Contrary to popular belief, the U.S. joined World War II with purely nationalistic intentions, and it was not merely a response to the Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor, because at the time, Japan merely wanted to poke at the countries of the West in their effort to obtain as many valuable raw resources as they possibly could. As the U.S. saw war being waged in Europe, they wanted to remain isolationist because of their repercussions they were suffering from the Great Depression. But along with persistent fighting and Japan wanting to spread its power even more, they slowly began the urge to fight. Fighting could have helped their allies in Europe because of the repercussions they were suffering from World War I.
At first, the United States believed it best to focus on itself and its own reparations from the Great Depression, but as the fighting wore on, it soon realized that it had to prove its own worth. The country as a whole was still hurting from the Great War and the following Great Depression, and desperately needed a strong and quick turnaround to get the country as strong as ever. The U.S. saw war being waged in Europe and knew that that's exactly what the country needed to strengthen itself, since wartime prompts quick improvements of technology, with the competition of the opponent being the strongest of all motivation. Yet they were not quite ready militarily and economically to join in at first. As time went on, America was building itself up and getting closer to aiding its allies on the European front, and Japan gave the United States a perfect reason for joining the battle they knew they probably couldn't avoid. The U.S. finally had been granted what it was looking for.
And when Japan met with fascist leaders Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, they created the Berlin Pact, in which they decided to plan an attack on Pearl Harbor. When they did, it more so gave the Americans a nationalistic rallying point to fight behind. So in the end, the U.S. joined World War II with nationalistic intentions of helping their allies in Europe and fighting against the fascist regime.
While in wartime, the United States would go on to see the development of multiple inventions such as numerous New Age firearms, more reliable and improved automobiles and aircraft, as well as the more practical and everyday inventions such as the radar system. These and many other technologies would have taken much longer to develop without a war to be fought, since there would have been much less necessity for such research. The United States achieved their original nationalistic goal of putting their country on top of all others technologically. The last and most influential advancements made by the U.S. was their most effective way of increasing their military power, the atomic bomb. With the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world then knew that the United States was a force to be reckoned with, clearly labeling the U.S. as the superpower. The bomb itself, along with the other improvements, would only have happened as quickly as they did during wartime. Through joining the war, the U.S. advanced rapidly in its technology and military power, all in the name of bettering the American brand. The United States' involvement in World War II was not only prompted by the country's nationalism, but also caused nationalism in the country to flourish through the efforts of the entire country focused on the military and the war. Because of the desire of Japan to grow larger and larger, as well as the intense fighting going on in Europe, America was more than ready to join in and use it as an opportunity to show that they were truly a dominant world superpower. Once the country joined the war, it initiated a total war, and the entire country's focus was on defeating the Axis power, causing nationalism to thrive since the country was willing to sacrifice common luxuries in an attempt to win the war. Despite common belief that the U.S. had to join the war in a reactionary move to the attacks on Pearl Harbor, or that they were obligated to because of their alliances, the United States nationalism was the true inspiration for their involvement. Once they joined, technology soared, a new wave of warfare was created, and the name of the United States was bolstered.
Nationalism was a key factor that pushed the Soviet Union into the war so they could expand their empire and spread communism to their new territories of Eastern Europe. During the build-up to World War II, the Soviet Union built a strong case of nationalism. They held the belief that their form of communism was the best form of society and that it should be spread throughout the world. and the Soviet Union had plans to expand its borders to Eastern Europe nations as a start. Soviet propaganda promoted the removal of national, cultural, and religious distinctions in order to have a united international working class. They knew that the upper classes would not accept their ideals and that it would be more likely to take military force to accomplish their goals, so Joseph Stalin began to build and strengthen their military. Stalin was also very strategic when making alliances and treaties with other nations.
The German-Soviet non-aggression pact that Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler signed in August of 1939 really helped develop the Soviets' plans for expansion during the 20th century. Both the Soviets and the Germans received an economic benefit from the deal through trade agreements, but strategic benefits were much more important. By guaranteeing no military conflict with Germany, the Soviets essentially bought themselves time to bolster and prepare their troops for the upcoming war. Another key part of the pact was the division of Eastern European countries between Germany and the Soviet Union. The pact granted control over Eastern Poland and the Baltic nations of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia to the Soviets.
The Soviets changed their tactics for propaganda in the 1930s in order to build a strong sense of patriotism and brotherhood after the Civil War in the 1920s. To do this, they switched their propaganda from focusing on materialistic ideas to instead portray soldiers as almost mythological heroes to generate a sense of national pride. They built up real events to portray their soldiers as heroes and made completely fictional stories up to portray the same thing. The Soviet government also squashed any anti-nationalistic sentiment in the newspapers and media outlets. During this time, Stalin also coined the term motherland, a term which hadn't been used for years and cultivated a sense of pride and patriotism among Soviet citizens. Once the Nazis attacked the Soviets, the propaganda quickly switched to anti-fascist materials. The Soviet government also utilized the radio heavily in order to reach the citizens directly during the war. After the war, nationalism dictated how much of the Soviet Union treated international affairs. They had a pre-war plans to expand their rule and way of society into Eastern Europe, and they worked to execute these plans after their victory. Their expansion included the annexation of the Baltic nations of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, as well as Eastern Poland and Eastern Czechoslovakia. They also desired good working relationships in the neighboring nations that they did not control. To gain this, the Soviet Union implanted or helped existing communist parties gain control of Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Yugoslavia, and its occupational zone of Germany. Western Europe and the United States were wary of how the Soviets were handling Eastern Europe, never recognized the Soviets' annexation of the Baltic nations. The Soviets' quick and aggressive expansion led the United States to try and prevent further expansion leading into the Cold War. The Soviet Union kept its nationalist views and desired to spread communism until its collapse in 1991.
The end of World War I left all of its participants in ruins. Whether these countries struggled to rebuild infrastructure, re-establish their economies, or regain public trust, all had a plethora of problems on their hands. Turkey was no exception. With their recent defeat to the Allies in World War I, along with the recent mass genocide that took place from 1915 to 1920, the Turkish people were looking for someone to lead their country. The sick man of Europe back to its former greatness. During and after World War I, from 1915 to 1923, the Ottoman Empire carried out the systematic removal of Armenians from the empire. The Armenian population in Armenia and Anatolia was deported to Syria as well as massacred in large numbers by the Committee of Union and Progress, more commonly known as the Young Turks, who sought to eliminate all non-Turks for a new empire they hoped to create that would span from Anatolia to Central Asia. The United States, Great Britain, France, and Russia condemned the genocide and told the Young Turks that they would be held responsible for their actions taken towards the Armenian population. But no serious action was ever taken, since these countries were already reeling from their First World War. Almost immediately following the Great War, Turkey was plunged into a war for its independence. The Ottoman government did not resist Allied occupation after the war, but areas of resistance rose up throughout the Ottoman Empire, especially in Anatolia. Under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, this resistance succeeded. Kemal and his followers fought a war on three fronts against the Armenians, Greeks, and French. The Treaty of Kars and the Treaty of Lausanne, signed in 1921 and 1923 respectively, removed these countries from the three fronts, and in 1923, Kemal, along with his supporters, established the Republic of Turkey, officially removing the Sultanate from Turkey. Mustafa Kemal proceeded to institute sweeping reforms throughout the newfound republic. Kemal's goal was to modernize Turkish society by modeling it after European society. In his 15 years as president, he tirelessly worked to modernize Turkey's economic and social infrastructure. Kemal created rail and factory systems and adopted Western culture such as the Gregorian calendar and Latin alphabet. Additionally, he passed suffrage laws for women and other gender equality laws and secularized school and courts. Before his death, the people gave him the title Atatürk, meaning Father of Turks. This period of progress laid the roots for a newfound Turkish nationalism based in faith in the new institutions set up by Atatürk. After Atatürk's death in 1938, İsmet İnönü, one of Kemal's closest advisors, was elected as president of the republic. On Kemal's deathbed, he warned of the imminent World War. As World War II broke out, Turkey was caught in the middle of Allied and Axis territory. Specifically, it controlled the Straits of Dardanelles and Bosporus, which connected the European and Asian territories. In addition, the Allies and Axis relied on Turkey's supply of chrome for weapons development. By the 1940s, Germany, Great Britain, and the US all had very large economic stakes in Turkey. They were purchasing foodstuffs, tobacco, olive oil, and other commodities in attempts to create dependency on their countries for export demand. It became a balance of trade between the two sides, with each side trying to convince Turkey to cut back its trade with the other. For instance, Churchill pressed Turkey to stop trade with Germany, but he knew that if Turkey were to do so, Great Britain wouldn't be able to compensate for the loss in export demand Turkey would accumulate by cutting ties with Germany. Therefore, a stalemate on Turkish loyalty remained throughout the war.
There's this common misconception that Turkey delayed joining the war so late, 3 weeks, in fact, before the war ended, purely for economic reasons. It was situated between the Allied and Axis powers, so many historians point to that and say that they were just using their advantageous position to just exploit both powers due to the economic dependency they had gained on Turkey for various products such as especially chrome.
İnönü would have also been aware of the fragility of his country. The new Republic of Turkey could not afford to plunge into a war on the losing side, so İnönü had to be completely sure which side was the correct one to support. The fragility of the Republic rested in his hands.
The population was split pretty much evenly between the Allied and Axis support, and by supporting one of the sides, İnönü knew that the country would be sort of shifting its political focus on that side's philosophy. So by supporting the Allies, he'd effectively be supporting the country they had waged war against just a few years before. By supporting the Axis, he would really be taking a lot of rights away from the minority groups that Ataturk had worked so hard to gain rights for.
Though there was a stronger sense of national pride developed by the previous leader, Ataturk, being on the losing side of the war could completely undo everything he had accomplished, crushing this newfound Turkish pride. So when Turkey finally joined the war on the side of the Allies, it was clear who the winner was going to be. It joined the effort just 3 weeks before the Allies secured victory over the Axis powers. It never even had to mobilize troops. This was probably good for the state, as in years to follow, it was faced with high inflation and debt, which may have exponentially increased had they fought in the war.
By delaying choosing a side, İnönü was keeping the country out of more of a crisis than it currently was during that wartime, and it really ended up benefiting the country overall.
Nationalism is making a comeback in Europe and the rest of the world today. The development of Brexit and the successful campaign of Donald Trump shows that nationalism is surging once again. Great Britain's move away from the European Union has been fueled by a rise in nationalism in the country. The Conservatives have wanted to break away from the rest of Europe and re-establish isolation. This means closing of open borders and the end of free trade, as well as other outcomes. Such a nationalistic move as this has put Great Britain in a tough situation, as their relations with the rest of Europe have been for the most part severed. The same could be said for the United States, as the election of Donald Trump proved that Americans were seeking a leader focused on nationalism. However, his isolationist policies, such as travel bans and work to end international treaties, has put him and his administration in question by the rest of the world. As things evolve globally, nationalism is becoming a stronger influence on countries such as North Korea and Russia. And the goal for the world should be to curb these tendencies and learn to cooperate and avoid further conflict.